Before the pandemic, there was increasing recognition for the arts and cultural sectors as a factor in economic growth, especially in metropolitan areas such as Boston. But over the past 8 months, with restrictions on gatherings and in-person contact, the economic losses for arts and culture have been especially severe. With an update on the losses and some signs of hope is the acting executive director of the Massachusetts Cultural Council, David Slatery. Thank you very much for being with us, David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, Chris.
David, I think a lot of us are used to thinking of arts and culture as a nice thing to have in your economy, but what about being an economic driver? To what extent is that true, at least around the Boston area?
Well, I think long before the pandemic, people realized that arts and culture, especially in Massachusetts, has been a driver of the economy. I believe there's been recent surveys put out by the Americans for the Arts and others showing that for every dollar spent on arts and culture, there's a $7 impact on the economy, just in terms of restaurants, service workers, and other sorts of related items.
But what about the losses? They were pretty bad the last time you and I discussed this, but what has happened since the spring?
Right. So this is the fourth survey we've actually undertaken since the pandemic, and we've consolidated all of the responses together individually. Just about 900 separate organizations have responded. And yes, the number of losses has increased. We documented from the respondents about $425 million in cumulative losses through July. We're now up to $483 million, a big increase. But perhaps the more striking increase is the number of jobs impacted. Organizations reported 17,000 jobs either laid off or reduced hours as of July. That number is now 30,600 and some. So again, almost doubling the impact on people's lives in terms of employees.
I know it's not good news, but a lot of workers who lose jobs can collect unemployment because they have steady jobs. But what about arts and culture? Aren't there a lot of people who have, more piecemeal kind of employment?
Yeah, that has been very difficult for the field. And I mean, I think the early economic stimulus packages addressed that somewhat with the enhanced payments and was a little bit more open to the gig worker, the temporary worker. We are hoping for a new federal stimulus program. Again, one doesn't know what to expect from Washington these days, but definitely that is something that the individual artist community has brought to our attention greatly here.
Well, adding to the burden is the cost of reopening, if you are able to reopen to some degree, because I guess you've got all these precautions you have to observe, right?
Right. We have identified, and it was funny, the number stayed the same from the July survey through the October survey, approximately $117 million in reopening costs. Now, only about 10 million of those are capital costs, air handling systems, HVACs, plexiglass, permanent plexiglass providers. The other costs are just the costs of how do you operate in a pandemic environment. If you're a theater and you have 1,300 seats and you can only seat 300 or 400, how do you make that economically work? If you're having to do things more virtually, how are you monetizing the experience? Are people willing to pay as much for a ticket to have an arts and culture experience? Those are things that the field is very much undergoing. Training, just training your staff to deal with things involved in the pandemic, whether it's lost concession revenue in performing arts organizations or in gift shops and museums and places such as that organizations have relied on for extra revenue over the years. All of these costs add up, and I mean, in fact, it's the majority of the costs are the things that lost projected revenue they foresee coming. That will be part of the cost of opening up.
Well, as your report notes, there is a distinction between earned revenue, which is, the gate,
Right.
and contributions. Why are the contributions down so much?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of what are contributions? How do you get most of your money? Bringing people together in events. In fact, that's one of the superpowers, not only of our agency, but of the arts in general, bringing people together for a common experience. What is the one thing you cannot do in a COVID atmosphere? Have groups of people in a crowded room inside interacting with each other. So I think you're seeing, and frankly, you know, with lesser activity, it's probably, you can have some appeals to your donating public to support you during a tough time, but when you're not doing anything, I think your opportunity to be out there and fundraise is also impacted.
I know there aren't many silver linings right now, but I think there might be a few out there, especially with individuals or organizations that are finding new ways to reach audiences, usually virtually. But anything you can tell us about, especially if it's being supported by the council?
Well, I could say we have a wish to support things. We are still waiting for the state budget to be finalized so that we have an allocation to work and support organizations. And we've heard good news on that recently, so we're very hopeful. Both the House and Senate have come in to level fund us in fiscal 21, which we're in the 5th month of right now. But one of the things we are definitely looking at is the need to deliver the product, the arts and cultural product, virtually. How can people do that? One is, what kind of technology do you use? And two is, what kind of methods can you use to attract an audience? And how can you monetize that, i.e. to replace program revenue that you may have received in, you know, pre-COVID times. But yeah, I have heard, I would say at this point, it's all anecdotal, that some theaters have been, you know, very successful in kind of pivoting toward producing virtual or Zoom related events and receiving a great deal of interest from them. Others are still learning it, and I think it's something the field will have to undertake, because it appears, even with hopefully a vaccine on the horizon here, it appears like we're going to have to live in this type of environment for some time yet.
And you know, you could have other kinds of distancing. I saw these opera arias being sung above Hanover Street while people were outside eating meals at their tables on the sidewalks. Is that an example of one of the adaptations?
An example, and it is one of the good things about working in arts and culture. It has tremendous amount of creativity is present in this field, and so we are hearing more and more ideas. Again, how much you can do that for how long is the big question to be asked, as we kind of have pivoted from the basic way people operated their mission, their businesses for years, and suddenly having to work in a world where you can't get together in groups. So.
I also want to explore some of the other types of people whose jobs have been affected here, because, you know, we've been talking mostly about situations that are very public and involve large gatherings, but, you know, you have people who might be teaching. You know, I can't imagine teaching a musical instrument unless you're very close to someone. I mean, Zoom might be somewhat helpful, but I mean, in the long term, I mean, how can you teach some of these things without being
I
there?
do know, and I do know our colleagues over at Arts Learning, which is a group which focuses on teaching arts and music in the schools. There's been a lot of back and forth about how to teach wind instruments in the schools in this day and age. And there are methods for addressing that, and I give them great credit for having studied that for a great deal of time and working with the Department of Education on that.
I guess you've got these other categories of people, even humanists as well.
Oh yes, and we found that, like, and we support a great number of teaching artists who do artist residencies in schools, which now have had to rethink their whole model of bringing their expertise to children in schools when you can't go in person. Even those places that have in-person schooling, they're probably not going to invite outsiders in. So we are kind of thinking of, it still has to go through our council for formal approval, but rethinking our artist residency program so that they are based upon being able to deliver services on a virtual or Zoom format or some other kind of broadcast format, which doesn't involve in-person learning. But yes, that has greatly impacted the individual artists that do teaching.
Now, I mean, a lot of us are still thinking, as in many sectors, that the pandemic will be tamed, the problem will go away, there will be a recovery. But even with that, do you worry about any permanent damage from what's happened, especially for the people who are suffering right now?
Yes, yeah, you can't help but think of it. I mean, yes, when nonprofit organizations and cultural organizations have to shut down, they don't have costs. But I mean, how many people lose their connection with the arts and culture industry, with their experience? How long can they survive during this period of almost hibernation. Yes, that is a great concern, and we are working closely at the agency right now to do. We've just put out an RFP, or just closed, for services to help organizations address issues such as that, and consider what are the responses in a world where you've had to reduce activity so greatly over a long period of time, and probably employ fewer people. How do you keep the engines going, so to speak?
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share the information with us.
Thank you, Chris. It's been a joy.
And good to see you again. David Slatery from the Massachusetts Cultural Council.